enigmatic and confusing. G'day my lovelies, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to talk about this, The Gunslinger by Stephen King, the first book in the Dark Tower series, which we are doing a read along of on my channel. I'm not going to hold this up the entire time, but I just wanted to show you this gorgeous cover by Michael Whelan, who has done a lot of great fantasy artwork. This is actually the revised edition. Originally, this was written in 1970 when King was only 19, and I believe it was interconnecting short stories which were then made into a novel but not published until 1982. It actually predates his first published novel of Carrie. It was again revised in 2003 and expanded, and that is the edition that I've got here, and that's the one that I read recently for this review. Though I have read both editions. I have read the original first publication of The Gunslinger as well as this one, and I've read them several times. Before I get started with the review, there are a few things I wanted to say. One is thank you to all of you who are reading along with us. I have set the timetable for each book in the description box below, as well as on my community tab. And I hope that you guys will continue reading this series with me because it is one of my all-time favorites. The second thing I wanted to mention, and this is really important, I should have said it in the announcement of the read-along, is that the Dark Tower series is complete in itself. You do not need to read anything else to enjoy this series. It is a standalone series. However, Stephen King does have crossovers between other books and the Dark Tower series. There are Easter eggs laid out through many of his books that reference the Dark Tower. You do not have to read those books for those Easter eggs. And whilst I don't think the Dark Tower series is going to spoil any other King books, there is one exception to this, and that is Salem's Lot. If you have not read Salem's Lot but wish to, then you should read it before Wolves of Calla, which is the fifth book in the Dark Tower series, and which we will not be reading until I think it is either September or October. The other two books that do have some minor crossover into the Dark Tower, which I will stress you do not have to read, are Hearts of Atlantis and Insomnia. I'm not going to go into a complete list of all the Easter eggs in King's other books that reference the Dark Tower. That is something that you can actually look up online. I will stress again, you do not need to read anything else but the Dark Tower books. This series stands on its own. As usual, I'm going to be splitting this review into 3 parts, without spoilers, with spoilers, and a summary at the end. And timestamps will be in my description box below. Alright, let's talk about The Gunslinger. It is a very small book for Stephen King. My edition is about 230 pages, and this is the Viking edition. I'm not sure when it came out, and I don't believe you can get them anymore unless you pay a fortune for them, but it is quite beautiful, I can't deny it. It also has some gorgeous artwork in it, which I'd forgotten about until I reread it. And I have read this edition at least 3-4 times. I don't even remember how many times I've read this book, which means that I have to be very careful what I say here because I'm so familiar with this series and I don't want to give away any spoilers. So as I was reading it, I was trying to look at it as a first-time reader, and what came to mind is that this is a very confusing book. It is enigmatic in many ways, opaque. There are so many strange elements to it, and it does not read like a regular Stephen King book. The writing is quite different to his usual style. Obviously, as any artist, his craft has changed over the years, which I love seeing. And whilst many people may not like the writing in The Gunslinger, I personally loved it. However, the very first time I read this, I didn't like this book all that much, I'll admit it. And it was before I started reading fantasy, but I read it because it was a Stephen King book. And I remember feeling very confused. And I think that is something many people might feel who are unfamiliar with this series. The Gunslinger pretty much plunges you into this world and explains very, very little. There are also certain terms or phrases that King uses, which again he doesn't explain. Things like, the world has moved on. What does that mean? We're not told what it means. All we're told is that there is a change. What is this dark tower? Again, something that is not explained in this book. And I believe that for many first-time readers, The Gunslinger is not a great introduction to King's writing because it differs so much from his other works. However, it is one of my favorites in the series because it is so different, because it is so opaque and enigmatic, because it encourages you to try to piece it together, to figure out what is going on. Where is this world? Is it our world, or is this a completely different world? Not much is explained in this book, but the opening line basically tells you the entire plot. The man in black fled across the desert. Fled. So he's running away, and the gunslinger followed. So the gunslinger is following him, obviously trying to catch him. It really does explain the entire plot. I do think that is one of the best opening lines I have ever read, and I think it's because it encapsulates the entire story in just those few words. I think it is a masterful display of writing, in my opinion anyway. So we start off the book with this visual in our head. Who is the bad guy? Who is the good guy? Or are they both shades of grey? We don't know. But it does put you in mind of thinking that the man in black, though he is wearing black, which we usually associate with bad guys, may not be the bad guy because he is being pursued by a gunslinger. A gunslinger is usually a killer, right? Somebody who kills. How do we know this? We don't. And that's the thing with King. He can be tricky sometimes. He can mislead you. And as the book progresses, we'll learn more about both of these characters to a degree. Our main character, the gunslinger, is Roland, whose perspective we share for most of the book. Now, this character, Roland, is also an enigma, is also laconic, so we don't learn a lot about what he's thinking, what he's feeling. We know he is the gunslinger. We learn that he is the last gunslinger. Why? We don't know. What we do know, though, is that he is in pursuit of the man in black, who we learn may have magical talents, may not, who he is afraid is setting traps for him. But because we have Roland's perspective, we can't assume necessarily that he is a reliable narrator. We don't know that. And the question of who is the villain of the piece, is there a villain of the piece, is unclear at least to begin with. And whether that is resolved in this book, I will talk about in the spoilers section. So during his pursuit of the man in black, Roland actually stops at a town, Tull. And what occurs there, actually, I think, clarifies for us just who or what kind of person Roland Deschain is. We also learn a little bit of his background, of his history. We also learn perhaps what motivates him to pursue the man in black. But during this time, we are also shown a world that is surreal in some ways. That's how it felt to me the first time I read it, and still to this day. This world is familiar and yet unfamiliar. There are strange creatures. There are strange events occurring in this world that it can be hard to decide, is it our world or is it not? Is it a dystopian world? Is it another world? I don't think that is actually answered in this book. And then we are introduced to another character, a new character, Jake, a young boy who has come from the city of New York and appears at a way station. I'm not saying anything that isn't on the blurb in my book, but Jake is a pivotal character in The Gunslinger. And what occurs with Jake shows us again the kind of characters we are dealing with. As for the world building, that has been done quite sketchily, in the sense that we are not told where this is, what this world looks like. We are only told hints that perhaps it's not quite like our world. We also learn that there is magic, some kind of magic in this world. But again, that is something that is not explained, not yet anyway. Now let's talk about Stephen King's writing. As someone who's read practically everything he's written, this reads so differently to his other works. In a way, I can also see some young arrogance, where he raises a philosophical issue, and yet overall the writing is quite impressive. It is very succinct in many ways compared to his later writings. Considering the length of the book, I did gain an overall picture of this world. I did gain an understanding of the characters, what motivates them. I personally really loved the writing in The Gunslinger. I love that it sets up this fascinating world or series where I don't know anything and I'm trying to figure out what is going on. I love that he doesn't explain everything. And I love glimpses of this world that we are reading about. Glimpses like a way station out in the desert. Glimpses of the life in this world at the moment, plus the suggestion that things have changed, that things were different in the past. I love that it raises so many questions that aren't answered in this book. And I will say, as someone who is very familiar with this series, reading it again, I can see so much foreshadowing. So many things that if you have not read the series before, you won't understand, but will be explained with time throughout the rest of the books. And that is how I believe a fantasy series should be. It shouldn't explain everything in the first book. It should leave a lot of questions. It should leave a lot of mystery to compel you to want to read the next, to find out what the hell happened in the first book. And of course, the ending of this book leaves a lot more questions than answers. But I would argue that is what a first book should do. It should not explain everything. All right, let's move on to spoilers now. And if you have not read the book, please do skip the next section. Spoilers. So many. Where to start? Let's start with Tal. When you see this character Roland, he is so laconic. He doesn't tell us much about his motivations except that he is pursuing this man in black. And later in the book, we learn that this man in black is a wizard, has magical abilities, may have cuckolded his father, for example. And he tells us when he reaches the town of Tal, Roland I mean, that he is waiting to see what trap the man in black has left for him. Now, this trap as such, I don't know what to call it, but clearly the man in black was able to either infect that preacher, I can't remember her name, or the entire town, pretty much. Let's not forget that the man in black was also able to resurrect this dead man. So obviously there are great magical powers in this world, but what they are we don't know. And then they all try to attack Roland, and he kills the entire town, including Killitz. Now I don't know about you, but I remember when I first read that, I couldn't stand him. I thought, oh my God, he is a ruthless killer. I don't care that this might have been a trap. I don't care that these people were trying to kill him. He killed everyone, the entire town. It does not make me like this character. If anything, his actions made me despise him. I don't care that he says it's a trap. Did the whole town deserve to be killed? I don't think so. So of course Roland has this major massacre on his hands. And then he meets Jake, who we are told he is learning to love, and yet decides that he is going to sacrifice Jake in order to be able to catch the man in black. Again, it makes you despise this character. He is so single-minded, so focused, that he doesn't care who he sacrifices to get to the man in black. For what? From what we can gather from his history, it's for revenge. His reason seems to be because the man in black cuckolded his father, though there are hints that it's a lot more than that. Nevertheless, Roland's actions throughout this book cannot be admired. He slaughters an entire town. He sacrifices a young boy who worships him. See, because I am such a character-driven reader, when I love a character, I can forgive many things in a book. But when I hate a character, and I remember hating Roland the first time I read The Gunslinger, it was really hard to get past. I couldn't love the man in black because he seemed a little insane to me, and his actions didn't speak of either good or bad. We just didn't know enough about him. But I remember loving Jake the first time I read this and being horrified at what Roland did, being horrified at Roland himself. So for those of you who hate Roland, I completely understand. But all I'm going to say is that he is a very, very complex character, and you will learn so much more about his character as the books progress. So give him a chance. I'm not saying you're going to love him, but you might understand him better. And in my opinion, just one thing that Stephen King is brilliant at is character work. He is so good at making you even sympathize with characters who you love to hate. So give Roland a chance, because he might surprise you throughout the rest of the books, and if not that, you will hopefully understand him better. What drives him? What conflicting motivations he might have, because sometimes it did seem he was conflicted in The Gunslinger. As for this ending, that is one I still don't understand fully, but was the sacrifice of Jake and the people in Tull worth what Roland learned? I would argue it wasn't. I would argue he learned more from the Oracle succubus. And that is the other thing about King. He does not shy away from sex or violence, especially in his earlier books, I think. It is meant to convey a bit more realism, perhaps. I'm not sure. I personally don't mind it, but I can see that it would bother some people. And I will say that there is more of that to come in other books. That's all I really wanted to talk about in the spoiler section. Let's go to the summary. Trying to evaluate this book as a first-time reader is quite difficult for me, given that I read it so often and I have read the entire series several times. But every time I read The Gunslinger, I like it more and more and more. I like how spare it is. I like how little it explains. I like the writing. I like the characters, though I don't like what they've done, but I like the description of the characters. I may not admire them, but I feel I have some understanding of at least the two main characters. I adored Jake, though a lot of people don't like him. I really did. But he is also a young boy who was plucked out of his world and plunged into this strange, bizarre world where nothing makes sense to him. And I also like that Stephen King shocked me with what happened in this book. I wasn't expecting it, especially with our main character. And for those of us who have read the series before, I can see so much foreshadowing in The Gunslinger. Things that aren't explained but will become clearer with time. So for those of you who found The Gunslinger confusing, unclear, opaque even, give it time. Give the series time. Read, or at least try to read, the second book before you make up your mind, before you decide on this series. Because it will explain a lot more and it'll make some things clearer, though not everything. Plus, King's writing style does change in the second book because he wrote it later. And there is a lot more to learn about Roland himself and his history as to why is he the last gunslinger, which means there were other gunslingers. What happened to them? Many of the questions that you might have at the end of The Gunslinger will be answered with time. I'm not going to score the book. I've decided that for 2025, I'm going to stay away from a numerical value. All I will say is how I found the book, and I think this is excellent. I love The Gunslinger. It is definitely one of my favorite Stephen King books, though in some ways it almost doesn't feel like a Stephen King book. Perhaps that's why I like it. It is something new yet again, or something different yet again. Well, that is all I have for you guys today. Now, of course, I want to hear your thoughts on The Gunslinger. Did you like it? Did you hate it? Did you love it? What did you like about it? What did you dislike about it? Do you agree with my review? Do you disagree? You know, I always want to hear from you. And let me know too if you are going to be continuing with the series. And if you don't wish to comment, that's fine. You can just put a little emoji, like a book emoji, to indicate, yep, you are continuing with the series. I'd love to know how many will continue and how many have decided, no, that's it for them. And no judgment here. As far as I'm concerned, not every book and not every series is for every reader. I will not be offended if you decide The Dark Tower is not for you. Though of course I want you to love it. I won't deny it. But I honestly never get upset when people say, no, this didn't work for me. Well, that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you all very much for watching. And I hope you will continue reading this series with me. The next book is The Drawing of the Three, which we have until the end of February to read. I will then bring out a review in March. And as usual, if you did like this video, you know what to do. You can like, comment and subscribe if you haven't already, as it helps my channel to grow. I also have a Patreon account if you wish to support me in that way. I hope you all have a beautiful day and I'll see you next time. Bye.